Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. It was never supposed to come out like this, not in the dim, echoing living room where the weight of old memories clung to every corner like dust that refused to settle, not with Noah standing frozen near the doorway and Sienna gasping in disbelief as the truth finally ripped itself free, because when Nick's hands closed around Sienna's throat it wasn't driven by lust or madness but by a desperate, unraveling need to silence the lie that had haunted him for years, and as his grip tightened just enough to make her eyes widen and her breath hitch, the room seemed to collapse inward on itself, every second stretching into an eternity where the past and present collided, and Nick's voice, low and shaking, spilled the words that had been buried beneath layers of guilt and denial. It was you. 3 simple words that detonated like a bomb, because in that instant Sienna knew there was no more hiding, and Noah knew his father was standing on the edge of a truth so ugly it threatened to shatter everything he thought he understood about his family, his childhood, and the man he had idolized. And Nick, eyes burning with a mixture of rage and regret, leaned in close enough for Sienna to feel the heat of his breath as he confessed that night in full, the night she had pushed him past the breaking point, the night her manipulation, her whispered threats, and her cruel certainty that she could control him had led to a moment he had replayed endlessly in his nightmares, because he hadn't meant to choke her back then either, hadn't meant to feel the life falter beneath his fingers as she laughed at him and told him he'd never be free. And as he spoke now, words tumbling over each other in a torrent of pain, he revealed how she had staged the aftermath, how she had turned herself into the victim and him into the monster, how she had used his fear of losing his family to keep him silent, and Noah, trembling, demanded to know why Nick hadn't come clean sooner, why he had carried this alone while the lies poisoned their lives. And Nick's answer cut deeper than any accusation because he admitted he thought he deserved it, thought his moment of weakness had damned him forever. And Sienna, finally finding her voice even as Nick released her and stepped back like a man waking from a nightmare, spat venomous laughter and accused him of rewriting history. But Noah saw it then, the flicker of panic in her eyes, the crack in her armor, as Nick laid out every detail, every threat, every calculated move she had made to keep him trapped, including the lie that Noah himself might be hurt if Nick ever spoke. And that was when the shock truly landed, when Noah realized the fear he had sensed in his father over the years wasn't guilt alone but terror, and the room filled with the raw aftermath of that realization, a silence so heavy it pressed against their chests, broken only by Nick's hoarse admission that he had hated himself for not being stronger, for letting Sienna dictate the narrative, for letting his own son grow up under the shadow of a secret that was never his to bear. And as emotions spiraled out of control, Sienna lashed out, accusing Nick of destroying her, of stealing her future. But Nick stood firm now, finally unchained, telling her she had done that to herself the moment she chose manipulation over truth. And Noah, voice cracking, stepped between them, demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding to know who he could trust. And Nick, tears finally spilling, told him the hardest truth of all, that heroes fail, that parents break, and that loving someone doesn't mean they are incapable of terrible mistakes. And as sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a reminder that consequences were closing in, the family stood at the crossroads of confession and collapse, with Noah forced to reconcile the father he loved with the man who had nearly destroyed himself to protect a lie, and Sienna cornered by the exposure she had always feared, and Nick, exhausted but resolute, knowing that whatever came next, arrest, judgment, or redemption, would at least be built on truth at last, because the secret was finally out, the chokehold of the past released, and nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same again. The next chapter began not with peace but with the echo of everything that had just been unleashed, because truth does not quietly settle into place in Genoa City. It detonates, and in the moments after Nick's confession the air itself seemed to vibrate as Noah backed away like the floor had shifted beneath him, his eyes darting between his father and Sienna as if hoping one of them would suddenly wake up and admit this was all some elaborate nightmare. But Nick stood there unmoving, shoulders slumped, stripped bare by honesty at last, while Sienna clutched her throat and laughed through tears that came too fast to be real, insisting she had won long before this moment because even now the damage was done. And that was when Noah finally spoke again, not in anger but in devastation, asking how many nights Nick had tucked him in while carrying this secret. How many birthdays, how many quiet father-son talks had been poisoned by fear? And Nick answered every unspoken question by dropping to his knees, a man broken not by exposure but by the realization of what his silence had stolen from his child, confessing that every decision he had made, every sacrifice, every sudden disappearance and unexplained rage, had been shaped by Sienna's hold over him, and Noah, shaking, demanded to know what else she had taken, what other truths had been twisted, and Sienna snapped then, her mask finally slipping as she accused Nick of weakness, of begging her to stay silent, of choosing self-preservation over justice, and Nick didn't deny it because denial was over now, admitting he had been afraid of losing everything, Noah, faith, his family, his name, and that fear had made him complicit, and the weight of that admission crushed the room into stunned stillness until the front door burst open and Victor Newman himself stepped inside like a force of nature, having sensed the fracture before the call even came. His sharp eyes instantly taking in the scene, his son on the floor, his grandson pale with shock, and the woman whose name had long been whispered in his suspicions standing exposed at last, and Victor's voice, cold and controlled, cut through the chaos as he asked one question only, "Is it true?" And Nick looked up at his father and nodded, a single movement heavy with years of buried pain, and Victor's jaw tightened as decades of instinct roared to life, because in that instant he understood not only what Nick had done, but what had been done to him, and the patriarch's fury turned not on his son but on Sienna, who suddenly realized too late that the game she had played was now being rewritten by men who did not forgive or forget, and Noah, overwhelmed, demanded to know what happened next, whether his father was going to prison, whether their family would survive this, and Victor answered with brutal honesty, that the truth would have consequences, but lies had already exacted their toll, and as police lights began to wash the windows in blue and red, Nick rose unsteadily to his feet, telling Noah he would face whatever came without running, without hiding, because he was done being owned by fear, and Sienna screamed then, accusing all of them of conspiring against her. But when evidence Victor had quietly gathered for years was placed on the table, recordings, messages, timelines, the final illusion shattered, and Sienna's bravado collapsed into hysteria as officers moved in, and Noah watched as the woman who had haunted his family was led away, realizing the truth was both liberation and loss, because nothing could return them to who they had been before this night, and hours later, long after the house had emptied and the sirens had faded, Nick and Noah sat alone in the quiet wreckage of their living room, father and son facing each other not as protector and child but as two wounded men trying to rebuild trust from the ashes, and Nick spoke softly about accountability, about therapy, about turning himself in if necessary, while Noah admitted he didn't know how to forgive yet, but he wanted to try, and somewhere across town Victor made calls that would ripple through Genoa City for months to come, determined that the full truth would surface no matter who it implicated, because secrets never stayed buried in this town. They waited, and as dawn broke over the skyline, a new chapter of reckoning, betrayal, and possible redemption began, one that would test the Newman legacy like never before, proving that the most dangerous enemy was never outside the family, but the truths they were too afraid to face. The next chapter unfolded under a sky that looked deceptively calm, the kind of morning that mocked the wreckage left behind by the night before, because as sunlight crept through the windows of the Newman house it illuminated a battlefield of overturned furniture, shattered illusions, and a family permanently altered, and Nick sat alone at the dining table long after everyone else had retreated, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, replaying the sensation of truth finally escaping his chest and wondering whether relief and terror could exist in the same breath, while upstairs Noah paced like a caged animal, his mind spiraling through every memory of his father now tainted by questions he never wanted to ask, because heroes weren't supposed to kneel in shame or confess to choking someone in a moment of weakness, and yet reality had forced its way in, relentless and unforgiving, and when Victor returned later that morning his presence filled the house with a unspoken promise that nothing would be left unresolved, his voice carrying the weight of generations as he informed Nick that the evidence against Sienna was already spreading through Genoa City, that whispers had become rumors and rumors were about to become headlines, and Nick accepted this with a hollow nod, understanding that public judgment was the final price of private silence, but it was Noah who surprised them both by descending the stairs and demanding to be heard, his voice steady, despite the storm raging behind his eyes as he declared he refused to let this story be told without the full truth. Not just the convenient version that painted everyone in clean lines of victim and villain, because he had lived in the gray too long to accept easy answers, and his words struck something deep in Nick, igniting a fragile hope that maybe accountability didn't have to mean total annihilation, but that hope was tested almost immediately when Phyllis arrived unannounced, her sharp instincts already piecing together what the rest of the town would soon devour, and her reaction, raw, furious, protective, sent shockwaves through the room as she confronted Nick not with condemnation but with heartbreak, accusing him of carrying the burden alone while everyone else paid the emotional cost. And Nick didn't argue, because excuses had died the night before, and as the day wore on the fallout multiplied, with calls from lawyers, reporters circling like vultures, and Faith's confusion adding another layer of quiet devastation, while across town Sienna sat in a cold interrogation room, her confidence evaporating as the narrative she had controlled for years slipped from her grasp, because the truth she had twisted was now turning on her with teeth, and when she finally demanded to see Nick, it wasn't out of remorse but desperation, hoping one last manipulation might save her, only to be denied as Victor ensured the walls closed in. And back at the Newman house Noah confronted his father again, not with accusations but with a painful honesty that cut deeper than rage, admitting he didn't know how to reconcile the man who taught him right from wrong with the man who had crossed a line and stayed silent. And Nick listened without interrupting, tears streaking his face as he accepted that forgiveness was not owed but earned, that love didn't erase consequences, and that the road ahead would be long and brutal. Yet when Noah finally said he wasn't walking away, just walking carefully, something inside Nick steadied for the first time. And as night fell once more over Genoa City, the ripple effects continued, alliances shifting, old enemies sensing weakness, and the Newman legacy hanging in the balance as Victor vowed to protect his family without protecting their lies, knowing that true power came not from control but from surviving the truth. And in the quiet hours before dawn Nick stood alone again, this time not crushed by secrecy but braced for judgment, understanding that redemption was not a moment but a process, and that the next chapter of his life would be written not in shadows but in the harsh, unforgiving light of honesty, where every step forward would be earned and every relationship tested. Because in Genoa City the truth never simply sets you free, it demands payment, and the bill had only just arrived.